Before prepping for this video, I had only seen probably about 2 Denis Villeneuve films, and since Dune has been a highly anticipated film for many, it opened up the opportunity to do a ranking on all his films. So starting from not seeing many of his films to now seeing them all, he has soon become one of my favourite working directors, so I'm happy to talk about all his films, which we're going to rank in this video, starting from the worst and moving to the best. But before we get into it, let me know what your ranking would be, and if you've seen Dune or Dune. You know, whenever I say June, people think I'm talking about the month, but that's how we say in England. But anyways, let's get right into it. Coming in at 10th and last place is MAELSTROM. His early films, they're all in French, so I may butcher some of the names of the people, the actors, even the title, like I probably did then. That's what happens when you drop out of French. For a director with so many fantastic films, which we'll touch upon in a second, this is certainly his weakest. It doesn't stand beside all of his other films that have yet to come, obviously, as it's one of his earliest ones, so it's like a bit of a learning curve for him. He was inexperienced at the time, and some of the plot aspects just don't really work. The cinematography, albeit not some of his best, is still good, especially for how inexperienced and young he is when he made this film. But overall, the film just feels awkward, and I don't know if this was down to the translation, but I was confused at times. But it's one of those films which will stick in your mind for a while, because the film is narrated by a fish, you know, a talking fish, which consistently gets chopped up. But so it's a really weird, wacky film, one which I don't think delivers, especially compared to all his other films, but as I said, just a minor fault in the magnificent work he has done, which we'll talk about in a second. Coming in at 9th place is August 32nd on Earth. This is Villeneuve's first movie, and just the way it's shot is spectacular, establishing some really impressive shots right off the bat from his debut film. This was a film which was hard to track down. I ended up watching it on YouTube of all places, and I was impressed with the acting performances and, as mentioned, the cinematography. The story can let itself down at points, just like MAELSTROM. I think that is partially down to perhaps the translation, because there are some things which maybe don't translate as well into English from a story point of view, which left me kind of confused. It leaves many unsatisfying unanswered questions and glosses over aspects which would realistically require more thought. But as mentioned, the 2 leads were good. They had solid chemistry. I'm going to attempt to name them, but it's going to go horribly wrong. Pascal Bucieres, sounding more Spanish from the way I said it, and Alexis Martin, their performances had my interest for the whole duration. So they were the real strong suit of August 32nd on Earth. As you could see by the ratings in my MAELSTROM and August 32nd on Earth part of this video, those were quite low. From now on, there is a big gap between August 32nd on Earth and the film I'm about to talk about, and from then on, things are pretty tight, and you'll see what I mean with the ratings. Coming in at 8th place is POLYTECHNIQUE. I'm not gonna lie, as it was one of his earlier films and I've seen how greatly reviewed his more modern films have been, I wasn't expecting to like this one nearly as much as them, but I managed to stand side by side with some of them, only narrowly missing out. The era of black and white film is something of the past, but POLYTECHNIQUE brings it back to execute and display the tragic feeling of this film. Denis Villeneuve manages to display such a horrific event in a visually stunning way. I wasn't aware of this story before this film, but after researching it, this film stays true to the real life tragedy and doesn't add any new aspects for the purpose of making it a better film like other films have done in the past. The only changes made were the characters' names, just to protect those who were involved and out of respect. And by doing that, trying to stay as real as possible besides the changes of profiles, Denis Villeneuve focuses more on the tragedy than a certain character following all the way through it, thus meaning there are a lot of powerful moments which do not contain any dialogue. It's just the sound of, you know, the gunshots or just anything. It's really tragic, and with that lack of dialogue, suspense feels its place, making for a really shocking film, yet beautifully shot. What may let this film down is the tragedy itself was fairly short. I believe it was only like 20 minutes long. This film itself is quite short, it's like an hour and 15 minutes, so although it's a short film displaying a short tragedy, it can feel dragged out in certain aspects. That's what prevents it from being higher up on this list. However, a really good and tragic film, but maybe not one for everyone as it's really depressing. Perhaps controversial, but coming in at 7th place is Blade Runner 2049. This was one of those films of his that I had seen, and the amount of effort gone into creating this dystopian world is absolutely brilliant. So much detail into every little aspect, but that's including the usual flying cars you have in these sort of things, or just smaller details which many haven't thought about doing, which makes this stand out amongst other futuristic and dystopian worlds. The enchanting score and beautiful cinematography helped me feel like I was involved with this film and created this feeling like I was worried for whoever's involved because it felt so real. You get most of Villeneuve's films. This is a sequel to Blade Runner from 1982, however, you don't need to watch that film to understand this one. Yes, it probably enhances your viewing as you get callbacks to that one and Return of Harrison Ford, but this stands by itself as just a great sci-fi film. In terms of cinematography, acting, score, story even, Blade Runner 2049 is flawless. However, where I have it so low down and maybe with a lower score than usual is the pacing. By having this film nearly 3 hours long, Villeneuve's allowed to display more about his world and possibly set up for future projects in this world with the amount of detail he has put into it. But in doing so, it can be very slow, especially as there's not that much dialogue throughout this whole film for a nearly 3 hour long film. He uses many long pauses to create drama and tension and make character interactions feel real. However, when you have a film this long which does that constantly throughout, it can make me lose interest, and that's not to say he did anything bad, it was just that pacing which isn't for everyone and it wasn't for me. I actually fell asleep during this. That's not to say it's a boring film by any means, but just where it got really slow at points. That's the thing that let it down for me. However, don't take anything away from it because I know this is some people's favourite movie of all time and I completely get that. It's all down to your patience with pacing. If this film had about 20 minutes trimmed off of it, this would have a much higher rating. However, nonetheless, it's still a great film, just as I said, the pacing that lets it down. Coming in at 6th place is Enemy. Now, I'll start off by saying that this film isn't for the usual moviegoer. If you're here to pass some time, you know, maybe have some of the usual stuff you'll see, you will not get this here. This is a very psychological film, and overall your enjoyment of this film comes down to your interpretation of it. I've only seen this film once, but I feel like it can gain a higher score if I were to rewatch it a few more times, now knowing some aspects that I've taken away from it afterwards and seeing the little details that play out for that answer. But that isn't for everyone. I won't lie, I really did enjoy this film. I mentioned that this film may require some rewatches to fully understand it and maybe watch an ending explained video. However, the story is absolutely fantastic, led by one of my favourite actors, Jake Gyllenhaal. Plays two subtly different characters with the same appearance, so at times it can be hard to tell them apart, but that kind of adds to the story of not knowing who is who. Like I said, I won't say anything about the ending here, but once you know about that and you go back and rewatch it, I'm sure viewing those two characters will add to your experience and how the story is told. I won't lie, I didn't know about this film until I looked through Denis Villeneuve's filmography, and watching through it and seeing some of the reviews, I was surprised that it doesn't get as much appreciation. However, it is truly a fascinating and engaging watch, and I really recommend it to those who are up for the challenge. But as I said, it's not for your average moviegoer. Coming in at 5th place is Arrival. This is what many consider to be Denis Villeneuve's best work. However, for me, as great as a film it is, I just prefer some of the other stuff on here. When you normally see a film about an alien invasion, you expect, you know, big action scenes, them trying to take over the world. But here it takes a different approach to it and shows the humans trying to communicate with them. Many different elements are tackled throughout the 2-hour runtime. You know, trying to communicate with the aliens, trying to understand their intentions, and many other aspects which I won't go into as they are spoilers. Arrival never feels silly, you know, it can deal with aspects which other directors would attempt to pull off to their best attempts and it would feel maybe a bit cheesy, but this always feels like a serious film. Once again helped thanks to the cinematography and those long pauses which build suspense. Familiar tropes from other films are used in Arrival, however just their way of going about it feels unique and is executed in a way which has never been done before, which ends up leading to one of the cheekiest plot twists in recent times and tops off one of sci-fi's greatest films, especially in recent years. Coming in at 4th place is Sicario. Denis Villeneuve dives into a content-heavy genre and manages to fish out a memorable, fantastic story filled with tense and shocking twists, and not to mention some award-worthy acting performances from Emily Blunt, Josh Brolin and Benicio del Toro, and as well as other side cast members who were fantastic. It may take a while to get into the flow of this film as a lot of aspects feel familiar, but once it does, the story elements just absolutely blow you away and has some really eye-opening scenes which relate to real-life issues. A bit like if you were a character in this film, you can feel safe at one point and then out of nowhere you can be attacked by tension and suspense, and then the score comes along which piles twice as much on top of you. There isn't a use of that score much because a lot of scenes tension is built up just by pure silence, whether that's characters being silent as well as lack of sound, or two characters are talking and there's no music in the background, purely building up the tension just from what the two characters are saying to each other. Amongst its genre, this film just stands above a lot of the others, just thanks to everything which is flawlessly executed once more by Denis Villeneuve. Coming in at 3rd place is Incendies. Once again, I don't know if I pronounced that right, but thankfully it's the last one on this list, which is in French. This is considered to be the film which essentially blew up Denis Villeneuve to new heights, where he began getting some huge budgets with some massive A-list actors. So after hearing that, I was excited to check this one out, but didn't actually get around to doing it until a couple of days before making this video. This film is just jam-packed with quality, a lot of it being displayed without a score like I mentioned in the Sicario review. Where it is so powerful is the shocking elements that take place from start to finish, whether it's implying them or they're really happening on screen. It really shocks you and makes your jaw drop as if you were experiencing it all yourself. The main plot is focused around discovering family secrets, but as this takes place in the Middle East, that journey opens up for other side stories to play out which just add more quality and shocking aspects to the movie overall, but at the same time manages to capture some beauty with the cinematography and just beautiful scenery, which you can say for pretty much all of Villeneuve's films. Incendies has quite a slow starting pace, and you're probably wondering why this is so much higher than Blade Runner 2049 if that's the case, but where this film starts slow, it then it picks up and doesn't slow down with a really fascinating story, whereas Blade Runner 2049 is quite slow all the way through. So once you get past the slow beginning at points, you have a really fantastic yet shocking story to be told in Incendies, and like many great films, has an absolutely jaw-dropping plot twist at the end. Perhaps Villeneuve's greatest plot twist of all his films. And for that twist alone, it made the 130-minute runtime worth it. Coming in at second place is Dune, or Dune 2021. After failed attempts of bringing the Dune story to the big screen due to the sheer amount of content it has to cover, Denis Villeneuve manages to successfully tackle and present the story in its best possible way. Well, at least half of the story, because if you've seen the film, you know from the start it says Dune Part 1, and if you saw that, you could think, oh well, if it's only Part 1, it's not going to provide a conclusion to the story, therefore I won't be as invested. However, just the amount of quality we see along the way, whether that's the storytelling, the cinematography, just the world itself that is being created, it's impossible not to get caught up all in it and completely forget that it's a Part 1. I've seen the 1984 film and frankly it's quite an abomination, and it's very confusing to follow, lazily trying to explain it all in confusing narration at the start, and while there are little aspects which have kind of these recordings which explain certain aspects, everything makes sense in a natural way, and we're kind of eased into it, not as in like things are said out loud which people wouldn't normally say just for the viewer's benefit. No, everything feels natural and makes sense. From the start, finishing on an incomplete conclusion was expected. However, I was distracted from that, and when it eventually came, I was still satisfied and excited for an inevitable Dune Part 2, which I'm sure will get made. An easy comparison to make to Dune is Star Wars, however, it's still a completely different thing to Star Wars, and that shows how unique of a film this is and the world it is. It does have that sandworm which is similar to Star Wars, but other than that it's hard to draw too many similarities with it. A huge benefit with this score, we know we're going to get some great cinematography, but that combined with Hans Zimmer's score makes everything much more captivating. So Dune tells a wonderful story, but a story which is yet to be completed. So I'm really excited to see Dune Part 2, and if you've been following my channel, you'll know that Dune is my highest rated and best film of 2021, and who knows if that will change. But coming in at first place is Prisoners. This was one of those films of Villeneuve's that I had seen, and frankly it's a much better experience on rewatch, perhaps down to me having more knowledge about films these days and appreciating more aspects of it. Even besides that, I think this is another film which benefits with a rewatch. Once you know how it ends, you can pay attention to closer details. I watched it again with my friend and I picked up so much more of it, which frankly lifted my rating for it. It is a dark and suspenseful story, but somehow made beautiful thanks to, you guessed it, the cinematography from Denis Villeneuve's films. Combine that with great actors, you know, a vicious performance from Wolverine himself, Hugh Jackman, and the cool calmness of Jake Gyllenhaal. You combine that with a great director, it's a recipe for success. Perhaps a question about Villeneuve's films is why they have to be so long, and looking at this film before you start and seeing the 150-minute long runtime can be quite intimidating, but once you watch it, you'll understand why. It never really drags in any points. Obviously it's slow paced, but it maintains the same quality throughout, and all suspenseful little details. It makes you question whether that leads to finding Hugh Jackman's daughter. On many occasions, the camera lingers in certain areas which build that tension, allow the viewer to take in what is on show. What I've talked about before in this ranking is the lack of score that Denis Villeneuve uses. However, I think it's at its best here, where it simply does build that tension and the shock factor. Whether you're watching this as a huge movie fan or you're just someone trying to put on something, if you're on your phone watching it, as soon as Hugh Jackman's rage comes on screen, you're instantly putting that down as you're drawn into his performance. Prisoners is a tense film from start to finish. If you're watching properly, it should have you engaged for the whole runtime. It has, and I believe from personal experience, that each rewatch benefits your experience as you uncover small details which lead to that conclusion. Thank you so much for watching this video. As I mentioned, please let me know what your ranking is down below. Please don't be annoyed if I have a certain thing too low, because as you see by the scores, most of them are really close. I had a certain mood for that film. It could go up by just 1 or 2 places, just frankly due to the fact that there was very little score between a lot of these films. So yeah, I expect many different lists in the comments. If you will comment, I'd really appreciate it, as well as liking and subscribing if you haven't already. If you would like to check out my previous video, I'll leave a clickable card up in the corner here. But anyways, thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next video.